Welcome to this NRCoP hybrid webinar on body-worn cameras in the regulator space. I'm Kerry Lever. I'm the Chief Executive and Registrar of the South Australian Education Standards Board. We regulate early childhood services and schools here, and I'm your facilitator for today's event. We're coming to you live from U City in Adelaide with a room full of engaged and enthusiastic regulators keen to hear from our speakers. We also have an online audience of over 300 people today from across the country. I'm coming to you from Ghana country, and I'd like to open the webinar by acknowledging First Peoples from all our countries and pay my respects to them. We honour their wisdom and their stewardship of traditional lands, waters and customs which enrich us all. Before I introduce our speakers, a few points about the NRCoP webinars. All webinars are recorded and they're made available on the ANZSOG YouTube channel. We also prepare short videos of key points that you'll be able to access through social media platforms. We'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom for questions, and I do encourage you to post your questions. We will be leaving a good chunk of time at the end of our speakers. If you like the look of another question, you can upvote that question, and we will attempt to get to as many of your questions as we can during the session. We'll also ask our speakers to respond in writing for those that we don't get to during the session, and we'll add that resource to the webinar recording, and it will be available on the NRCoP website. If the Zoom webinar stream cuts out, please stay with us on the webinar, and the NRCoP team will work in the background to rectify the issue and get the stream back up to you as soon as possible. If your internet connectivity drops out, please restart your internet and rejoin the Zoom webinar. So today, in our session on body-worn cameras in the regulator space, we're going to explore what has driven decisions to use body-worn cameras and how they've supported the complex role of undertaking investigations in varying regulatory environments. As you hear from 3 different regulators today on their experiences, I've asked them to address the following questions. Why are body-worn cameras important to you in your regulatory work? What are the 3 biggest tips and traps in using them, deploying them and defending them? What legal considerations have you had to make in implementing and using them? And what kind of regulatory cultural setting supports the use of this tool? So in the order they'll be speaking, I'm going to briefly introduce them. Andrew Przinski is the Director of Operations for the South Australian Environment Protection Authority. Andrew has nearly 40 years of professional experience, 19 years in timber manufacturing, mining and environmental consultation, and 19 years as a senior environmental regulator. In his role, Andrew is responsible for compliance, regulatory practice, circular economy and waste, investigations, incident management, very long list, regions and licensing services. Glenn Farrell is the Executive Director at Safe Work SA. Glenn's career began in mechanical engineering within the aerospace industry in England, where he spent 15 years working for Rolls-Royce, a manufacturer of industrial and commercial jet aircraft engines. Glenn's move to Australia secured him a role at Safe Work SA, and for the past 19 years, he's worked across all areas of Safe Work SA, delivering successful enforcement outcomes. And Laura Paulus is the Manager of Mining Compliance for the Department of Energy and Mining here in South Australia. Laura is a respected legal professional with experience in both public and private practice. Laura complements her legal expertise and knowledge in regulation with practical and on-the-ground experience in safety and risk management. We'll now hear more from our speakers. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Kerry. So we'll bring up the slide. Thank you. You're most welcome to contact me. My email address is on the slides, and if you want to contact Lorraine, but for those in South Australian Government, I'm on the main mailing list. Briefly, the South Australian EPA adopted body-worn cameras about 5 or 6 years ago. It was really in response to what we saw as increasing aggravation from a lot of the people we regulate, particularly from the investigators' point of view. And I acknowledge my colleagues who are here today as investigators. But we thought that this is a good prevention strategy. Fisheries were using them successfully and had used them as a similar prevention strategy to de-escalate things. People, when they see you're wearing a body-worn camera, are less likely to be aggressive and less likely to do things that are unfortunate. However, having said that, we had an incident where a person was very aggressive and they could clearly see at least 2 people had body-worn cameras on, so it doesn't always work in that way. But it certainly puts people on notice, and it generally has worked well for us. We have 19 body-worn cameras. Our investigators all have their own personal camera each, and the rest are pooled cameras, which are maintained by the investigations team. When they come back to the office, they're plugged into their cradle, and it automatically uploads the data that's been gathered with the video and audio to the cloud, and that costs us about $31,000 over 3 years for that licence. It's good licence in that it's robust from an evidence point of view, and it can survive the court processes. So, and it's called evidence.com. I'm not promoting it. I'm just letting you know that that's what we use with our cameras. And we also have what are known as pro licences for the investigators. They offer a lot more functionality than the basic licence for the normal authorised officers. We have a policy on how to use them and when to use them. You're welcome to get a copy of that from me. Having said that, it's about to be rewritten because we've observed a few issues recently, so we want to update that, but I'm happy to give you a copy of it if you'd like one. And basically it requires all investigators to wear the cameras when they go out and do their work. For authorised officers, they must wear them when they know they'll be going to a hostile situation, or likely hostile, or a situation where they really should wear them because the individual's problematic or the organisation's problematic. So that's more of an encouragement than a must. For authorised officers, we have about 100 authorised officers of an organisation of 200. We normally encourage at least 2 cameras on site if we can, because you get to see what happened from multiple angles, and that's often helpful if you're in court, and it's often helpful for gathering an impression of what's going on. You'll always see what's going on over here, but there could be something else going on over here which someone else may capture, so that perspective is good. When we activate the cameras, our policy requires us to let people know we're activating cameras. So that's important, both from a respect point of view, but also if we need to use it as evidence, we'll need to caution that person formally that we intend to use this in evidence. The interesting thing with body-worn cameras, which a lot of people possibly don't know, is they have the capability from when you press turn them on, they've already recorded 30 seconds before that of evidence. So if something goes pear-shaped, you can activate them and you'll capture what's happened before you've even activated it. So that's really good. That's a great feature. And we, unlike some of our colleagues, regulators, we being the EPA, have specific powers in the Environment Protection Act, the Radiation Control Act and the Local Nuisance and Litter Control Act. We can gather information in the form of video evidence and audio evidence, and it overrides anything from the Surveillance Act. So our Act gives us explicit permission to use this, which is really good, quite forward thinking from the authors of the Act back in the day. And really, we have to be very careful with how, particularly for the investigators, how they handle that evidence, because we have to have a master copy which survives court. You can't tamper with it, you can't amend it. But the licences do allow us to redact things if the court was to request things to be redacted for whatever reason, which is good. All of our evidence could be, all of our footage, if you like, or video could be subject to freedom of information. It may be subject to public register as well, which is freely available. So we have to be conscious of what we're gathering and how we're gathering it and why we're gathering it. It's not just ad hoc decision making. And people can claim privilege, but that would have to be determined by the court. So these are the sorts of things we turn our mind to, and the Pro licence will allow people, our team, to put up to 4 images, stitch them all together all at the same time. It doesn't take away the need to make good notes of a conversation. You should still do that, and of your observations, but it does have a permanent record, which is really good. Some of the disadvantages are that it can imply a lack of trust. If you go to a hostile community meeting, walking in with a body-worn camera, what are you trying to say to the community? What are you trying to say to the homeowner, if that's the level of the person you're engaging with? Even if you were to walk into a meeting with at a licensee's premises and into their meeting room and you've got your camera running, what are you trying to say to them? I don't trust you. So that sort of level of how you're portraying yourself is important, and you really do need to turn your mind to that before the meeting. And perhaps if you're wearing it, maybe there isn't a lot of trust or a lot of relationship going on. But so that's something to think about. And it may prevent someone from having an open conversation with you knowing they're being recorded. Often you'll go and meet with someone and they'll say, oh, look, on the side, this is what's really going on. Just don't tell my boss. And so you're not going to get a person probably saying that if they know they're being recorded. So it can prevent that open dialogue because everything's on the record. So no off-the-record discussions. Not there's a lot of off-the-record discussions with us anyway. But the benefits are great. We get to, as I said at the start, limit aggressive behaviour. It deals with vexatious complainants. So if someone says, an authorised officer tried to threaten me or abuse me or, in exchange for this, I'll have that, all those sorts of claims, it really keeps a permanent record of that discussion and that conversation and that site visit, which is a fantastic record and indisputable. The other benefits are it provides an opportunity to capture what was going on the site during your visit, and this provides a permanent record of what activities were being undertaken on the site, or where plant was or equipment was, or how things were being stored. And you can always go back to that and see that and compare that to the next site visit you may have. So these are really important functions. And then it also allows you to see who might have been on site, which individuals were there, and identify who they are, and perhaps ask why they were there later on when you get a chance to analyse the footage. And finally, for our investigators, it gives them an opportunity to scope the site out for the purpose of maybe future surveillance, and where you might put covert cameras or surveillance devices, which we have powers to use under the Act as well. So it gives you that additional feature to come back to the office and think about that more carefully and how you might access those places and locations and so on. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. They're a great tool. We really enjoy using them. We use them a lot. We do, one of the other downsides is that they require a lot of data, in that a lot of gigabytes. Okay, so you've got to think about that and what that sort of costs as well. But yeah, thank you, Kerry. Yep.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, we're now going to hear from Glenn. Glenn's not quite as far down the journey in terms of implementation, so we'll hear more about how body-worn cameras usage came about at Safe Work SA. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Kerry. And there's so many synergies from what Andrew said to what I'm probably going to talk about, but our journey began, I hate that word journey, but our journey began, our body-worn camera journey started in 2018 when the Anti-Corruption Commissioner, Bruce Lander, former Commissioner, decided to have an open public evaluation of Safe Work SA because we were due for another review. So as a result of that, there was 39 recommendations, one of which was that inspectors and investigators should wear body-worn cameras. But this was with the bent from minimising anti-corruption behaviour. So you can imagine that went down like a lead balloon when we're trying to convince our investigators and inspectors that we should be wearing body-worn cameras to stop you from all being corrupt. That was kind of like the essence, if you like. We were able, obviously, to talk with the former commissioner around how can we look for some more benefits to body-worn cameras and introduce them into the report so that we can highlight the real benefits. And Andrew's mentioned a lot of the benefits. The first one for me, I'm the work health and safety regulator in the state, so I want to ensure that my workforce are as safe as they can be whilst out in the field. So inspectors have incredible powers. And of course, if you've got powers to shut down organisations or stop activities from happening, you are potentially open to bribes and maladministration, etc. But you're also exposed to aggression if you are potentially going to close somebody down. So safety is number one for me as far as the potential benefits that they bring from that aspect. Secondly, obviously, the evidentiary benefit of having almost real-life footage as an inspector is walking and talking a scene. You can't get anything better than live, full coverage, as opposed to a series of photographs that you somehow have to string together in the future. And obviously, as Andrew's already said, you can go back and review what you've seen. So if you have potentially inadvertently missed something, you can go back, review and say, okay, we can take another approach to picking some other anomalies up. So that was really where we started from as to the why. The second phase was going into the research. So yes, we looked at our own legislation. Our own legislation gives us enormous powers to take recordings, take photos, videos, etc. So we thought, oh, we're already captured. Actually, we're not. Based on legal advice, we had to refer to the surveillance devices legislation to find out what we needed to achieve to fulfil the obligations under there. So slightly differently to EPA, they have a specific allowance in their act to use these devices. We had to look to that act and say, right, what do we need to do to make sure that we're fulfilling the requirements of that particular piece of legislation? Obviously, we also met with other regulators prior to deciding which option we might trial. We met with EPA, we met with DIT, we met with SAPOL, other jurisdictions around the country. Most organisations probably use the same product that we ultimately use, which is Axon. And the platform in which you host all this data and information is called evidence.com. So that's the option we also chose. We also had to look at the security of the data. So again, research showed us that there's only certain platforms that you can potentially utilise that has that security element that government expect. So there's no cyber risks at all. And the cloud that we use is a cloud in Australia. So that's another consideration as to where this information might be hosted. The second phase was around the trialling of the product. So we obtained, I think it was 14 cameras. We had 14 inspectors involved in the trial. We just pushed it out to say, right, go and use them in every work site. We had some hesitancy around inspectors engaging in the process. Again, they were thinking, what's this about? Is it about, managing our performance while we're out on site? So there was a lot of communication, consultation that needed to occur to get us to this point. We had strict interim processes in place. We were engaging with the relevant union in order to ensure that we weren't, there was no hidden agenda behind why we wanted to utilise these cameras. It was all for positive benefits. So the trial went for a few months. We were able to look at all the information that was gathered. We went to all different types of work sites, underground mines to dark and dingy manufacturing places to out in the open air type environments. So we were able to capture sound quality, video footage, the clarity of what was being recorded. So the trial also highlighted the fact that where do you these cameras are they have to attach to somewhere. So we were trialing different options for attaching the camera. It might have been on somebody's uniform, it might have been on a jacket. I think we tried these bands that went around the body. They all came up with different outcomes based on where you attach the camera to. So again, very important to try different options in that space. And cameras have multiple mounting options. It might be a magnetic connection, it might be a clip-on. Like I say, it might be a strap that goes around the head or the body. There's all sorts of different options. We then looked at, obviously, at the governance. So how do we put some controls around this? So again, we've just had the former commissioner go through us, and some of the other recommendations was putting some real strong governance around everything that we do as a regulator, given we've got such great powers. So the body-worn cameras sort of fell into our governance framework, so we needed policies, procedures, and a heap of user guides as well to really strengthen the requirements and the expectations on using such devices. We needed to stay within the boundaries of the powers of the inspector and also the boundaries and the scope of the surveillance and devices legislation. We've also got a quality assurance framework within Safe Work SA, so again, we needed to ensure that the use of the body-worn cameras were being used as we were expecting and as we'd sort of consulted on in the lead up to this process. The evaluation piece was really interesting because that was really some project officers looking at all the footage and evaluating and speaking with the investigators, inspectors, etc. What works well, what doesn't work well. So I think we're on the 4th or 5th version of our policy, and bear in mind we've only gone live with body-worn cameras in the last few months. We're on about, I think it's the 4th or 5th version. And as Andrew said earlier, we happily share all our processes, our policy, our guidelines to any other regulator who might be considering going on this journey. Even the ease of use. So we've got an inspector here today that will be able to show those that are in attendance the functionality of the camera and how easy they are to use. And also, again, it's like anything, something new is introduced into an activity or how you do your work. It takes a bit of time to get comfortable with it. And now we're in a position where people are very comfortable in using this great addition to their toolkit. So the implementation, we went for a risk-based approach. So the Commissioner suggested that all inspectors, all investigators wear them at all times. We decided to take this risk-based approach. So all critical events or matters of a serious nature or a fatality, for example, where we know that there's an aggressive client that's been flagged on our system, and also if there's a dispute. So inspectors can be required to go and assist with the resolution of a dispute. So that's a third option. All other all other matters that come to our attention is up to the discretion of the inspector as to whether or not they want to use a body-worn camera. So we've got pretty much 3 mandatory requirements and the rest is discretionary. So just on these are just some features of the actual system itself. So the cloud-based system is called evidence.com, the one that we use, located in Australia, as I said. The integrity of the evidence is incredible. So as Andrew said, once you dock your camera into the docking station, it's not only recharging it, but it sends all that data up to the cloud. Inspectors then go into the platform and label, depending on naming conventions, their evidence that they've gathered. We've had this platform for a couple of years prior to body-worn camera use, so we use it for photographs or any other video that we might take, or even taking statements. So we've got apps on our phones, it's called Axon Capture. Again, you take that information, it goes straight to the cloud, and the integrity of the evidence is solid. The auditing component, so it measures every keystroke. Anybody that's gone and looked at that evidence, it keeps a record of that. So we lifted our integrity on our digital evidence 100-fold when we introduced this system. It also transcribes audio, so as much as the notebook is so important for inspectors, you know, in the future, I'm sort of seeing that this could potentially be used as a means to replace taking copious notes, because it transcribes everything that you say into the camera. So you can walk and talk a scene. This is future stuff, by the way. It's not happening next week, and there's probably a few legal issues we need to get over. But walking and talking a scene and having that transcribed into a narrative, I think is going to be really useful for minimising that administrative burden that we often hear about. Yeah, there's some costs there per licence. So we've got, I think, just over 100 licenses. So that's for the duration of the contract per licence. So it's not cheap, but again, you've got to weigh up the investment in this compared to the scrutiny, the evidence abilities, the cost benefit as far as freeing up that administrative component, what the inspectors often get mixed up in. And the cameras themselves, there's 14 plus hours of battery life. Andrew mentioned that pre-event buffer. There's a cost associated with the camera itself, $100,000 a unit, and then there's this licensing fee per month for the units as well. But once you've engaged in that, I think when the new version comes out, they'll replace it for the latest version. I think we're on Axon 3 at the moment. And obviously they're tested out in the field, so they're very robust, and you'll get to see one later on as well, of course. As far as some tips just to finish off on, so certainly you need to get legal advice in how your legislation might interact with the Surveillance Devices Act or anything else that might play into your own legislation. Consult with your workforce early, I can't stress that enough, and really flesh out what the proposed use of the cameras are for. So again, we had to get over a bit of a hump initially because of what the Commissioner his angle was compared to where we saw the benefits. So there was a bit of work to do in that space. Certainly prioritise your policy development, because that's so important for giving people assurance on how to, what's the reasons for it, why we're doing it, why is it so important around evidence collection, the legal aspects of it, etc. And again, the staff and the representation within the workforce, whether that's union or health and safety reps, is so important, because again, this is quite a significant change and people have different perceptions as to why this might be introduced compared to what your true intent is. And look at different options as well to secure these cameras. We've chosen a particular high-vis vest. We use high-vis vests a lot, obviously, in our industry. So we've found a really robust one that keeps the camera in a very stable position. We trialled some other options. The camera was flopping forward, or it was sagging, and there was a whole range of issues in that regard. So spend a bit of time looking at the most appropriate clothing or vest, whatever it is you choose, for them to be most effective. And they're not suitable in all environments. Again, you might be able to get intrinsically safe ones if you're going into an explosives atmosphere, but the ones we aren't like that. So just bear that in mind as well, of course. And ensure that your message to the public is very clear. So we did some media campaigns in relation to why we were using them, how they were going to be used. There are businesses that do get a bit concerned about how we are using them. So again, very open to discussions when an inspector arrives at a workplace to decide when and when not to use these cameras. So obviously you're not going to walk into a hospital ward wearing a camera, or swimming baths or anything like that. So there's elements that we have to incorporate into our policies as to when you must and when you must not use cameras. But there's an element of discretion by the inspector on an ad hoc basis. So the future reference at the bottom there was literally about how could we use these in the future to be the most modern regulator as possible. And one of those things, like I said earlier, is about, I think we could get to a point where we're walking and talking a scene, everything's transcribed. So the digital capture of all the evidence that we have is put into one place, and then we can use other systems to start building briefs of evidence, etc. So I see these personally as a great tool to move forward and being a very modern regulator in that space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. We have some great questions coming through online. Thank you to those of you posting those. We'll get to them after we've heard from Laura. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you. So my contribution to this topic is more from a policy perspective, both from my experience in my previous role as General Counsel for the National Rail Safety Regulator, as well as in my current role as Manager of Mining Compliance for the Department of Energy and Mining. Back in 2018, when I was at the National Rail Safety Regulator, we obviously picked up on this report that the ICAC did into the evaluation into safe work. From sitting over on that space, it was very easy for us to kind of pick up this report and consider it as another safety regulator, and saw it as a really important proactive step to see whether there was something there that we needed to pick up on. We did look quite considerably at the body-worn camera recommendations. Those benefits that had sort of been set out by the Commissioner were really important for us to look at, because we had rail safety officers across Australia going to various sites. So the benefits that had been identified in the report were very much around protection for inspectors, reducing the likelihood of those aggressive and inappropriate behaviours, dealing with complaints, possibly influencing behaviour for the inspectors in a more positive way, evidentiary benefits for prosecutions and other such things that we would need to look at from an operational perspective. In particular, we were keen to look at the footage that could be reviewed to determine if something had been missed, given that they had railway sites all over Australia and some in some very remote areas, so having that benefit would be really useful. And lastly, obviously, a way to look at regulatory capture and some potential unprofessional or inappropriate interactions between officers and the stakeholders. We noticed that the report also raised some concerns from some of the external stakeholders around influencing that relationship and whether that would actually make the relationship worse. The National Rail Safety Regulator had a co-regulatory approach, which means something different, as I've learned from my current role. Co-regulation being a particular relationship between industry and the regulator, which they really prioritised. And so that was a general concern that would this actually negatively impact that co-regulation. We also noticed that there was a risk around stress for the inspectors. Would that put an unnecessary stress by having the camera on you? And then we would obviously look at the fact that there'd be a number of measures that we would need to look at in terms of consultation and the rollout of the cameras. Even though we were a national rail safety regulator, we were under state-based legislation, so we would actually have to look at complying with the surveillance requirements in 7 different jurisdictions to roll it out, which was a big consideration. So these were considered by the executive at the time, and we determined that we wouldn't roll the cameras out. And the basis for that at the time was rail safety officers always went in twos. The rail industry was substantially smaller than most other work, health and safety and even EPA industries, with only about 200 operators nationally. Most of these were sophisticated operators, if you set aside the tourist and heritage little tin pot railways. And we didn't really have the equivalent of a small business owner kind of interaction. Rail safety officers don't have to deal with the general public. That's something that police deal with. Passenger safety is not something within their remit. If a rail incident occurred, rail safety officers are not first responders and generally would be there probably the day after. So all the action's sort of finished. And the investigators already had a huge range of tools for when they would attend a site. So that camera wasn't going to be necessary. And in most cases, rail safety officers are escorted around a railway site. So the risk of some sort of adverse interaction with an operator is fairly limited because you're escorted by someone senior. So on that basis, it was ruled out. When I reflect on how we consider body-worn cameras in the mining context, the answers are a little bit different. Our stakeholder group, as I'm discovering 6 months in, is very broad. We have landowners, mining operators, exploration companies, neighbours and community engagement groups, members of parliament, other government departments. It's a huge set of stakeholders we have to deal with. There is a distinctive outrage factor that exists in mining, as I'm discovering. Out of 500 or so active mines across South Australia, this outrage percentage is still quite low overall. It does take up a lot of our time. It can be public, and it can involve senior personnel in the department or the Minister's office due to escalation, and can be stressful and affect our compliance officers and our investigators. We have several stakeholders very similar to my colleagues up here that make complaints, can be aggressive, and regularly make allegations against the competency of my team. We have implemented a strategy to look at the safety and protection of our inspectors going to certain sites, which include liaising with SAPOL. Regulatory capture is an issue we are tackling. We have invested in training to understand what that looks like and how to identify it. And it's something we can't get complacent about. So the cameras could be a really interesting deterrent from unprofessional or unethical behaviour. I note that one of the recommendations from the ICAC review was about monthly audits of the inspectors' footage and providing feedback. So I'm keen to discuss that concept further and whether anyone's done that, and whether that's done for everyone or whether it was targeted for particular inspectors and that where their behaviour might be a concern. So in that regard, we are very interested in body-worn cameras, unlike the National Rail Safety Regulator, and it's something we're really keen to engage with. But at this stage, I'm not keen to do a full rollout. We have a fairly small team anyway. We have hundreds of active mines and quarries, the larger majority of which are uneventful and cause no issues. So any role that we would undertake would be risk-based. So the key questions that we are looking at from a risk-based perspective, don't want that, I want this one, is around these high-risk sites. So are they politically sensitive, significant community sensitivity, abusive stakeholders, ongoing complaints, media interest, potential regulatory capture issues, or current or previous compliance issues or investigations. We intend to create a list of what we deem to be high-risk sites based on this criteria. I anticipate that would probably only be about 10 or 15 sites, so it's very small compared to the amount of operators that we have. My current premise is that our investigators would always have them on based on their interaction. We only have 2. But our compliance officers would only wear them where these sort of high-risk criteria are met. We still have a lot of work to do. Very much want to liaise with our colleagues here and learn as much as we can from their experience with body-worn cameras. I already have so many questions even based on this morning. Particularly issues such as something simple as storage of the footage, as well as the evidentiary chain of custody with those sorts of issues. And in fact, the thing I haven't learnt as of this morning was actually about the legislative issues in terms of what's in your act. So I'm already going to take that as a note. I'm keen to understand the admissibility of footage for a prosecution, whether there's been any change in stakeholders being forthcoming in the interactions of the camera, and whether there's been a difference in the inspector behaviour. I'm quite keen to understand that from a regulatory capture perspective, having different examples of that, particularly given the submissions made by the Public Sector Association in the review that's into safe work. So we will certainly be getting further advice from the Crown on that and link in with the other regulators. It would be a very small rollout for us, I think, but there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, so we'll certainly be piggybacking on the work already done. And we'll see what we can improve on. But our main goal with any kind of implementation of body-worn cameras will be ensuring that our teams are safe, that they can deliver their jobs professionally and ethically and within the context of our legislation. So I think the risk-based approach will be the way to go, and watch this space. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Excellent. And thank you for the whole panel for sharing your experiences and reflections today. We're going to move to our question and answer session. Laura, you picked up on something that I did see pop up on the questions around whether the footage is used to assist with professional development or performance advice and feedback to inspectors. So I might ask both Andrew and Glenn if that's planned or in place and what you think of that. Can I start with you, Glenn?
Absolutely. So look, the focus for us wasn't about performance as an individual, so that comes secondary. The QAE framework that we've implemented will ensure that body-worn cameras are being utilised as they should be in accordance with the policy that's been developed through consultation. If there's complaints lodged against individuals where we have to review footage and it identifies learnings from a behavioural essence, then absolutely we'll be addressing it in that regard. But we're not specifically going in looking for how inspectors are behaving. That's not a focus for us at this point in time.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, the same. I'm not aware of any review of footage for that purpose, certainly not routinely. There was certainly an incident where an authorised officer was assaulted that resulted in a criminal conviction and a suspended sentence, and that was captured, but not used in the end as evidence. But it clearly showed the offender's mindset from the time the authorised officers or the investigators walked on the site. So that was really useful. I guess, give peace of mind to the prosecution and to indeed those who were impacted by that they did nothing wrong. You know, when you sit back and review it in the cold, hard light of day, it helped them, I guess, work through that incident. It was pretty full on.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a number of questions, a high level of votes around the privacy if a request is made by an owner on a property to have the camera turned off. What do you do? Glenn, do you want to start with you?
You just say no.
Okay. Short and sweet.
So, look, we have had requests before. There needs to be a reasonable excuse, and that...
Excuse being the word there. Yeah.
But the reasonable excuse needs to relate to it being a very private setting. So they'll have to demonstrate why it falls into that realm. If we're having normal conversations with a business owner in an open setting, a workplace setting, that seemed to be potentially a conversation that's been overheard by others. So that puts into the public arena. So if people want to have a conversation in private, they can put it forward to us as to the reasons why they think it's a private conversation, and the inspector then can take that on board, whether or not to say, yes, okay, we'll take the camera off for that private interlude, or no, I'm going to proceed with the camera on. So it's not an option. We don't give people options. It will all come down to why they strongly believe that they shouldn't be recorded. As I said earlier, there's settings where we've put into our policy where we don't expect cameras to be used. And I would anticipate that list might grow in the future as we learn more about some of the complexities. As a work health and safety regulator, we go into every single workplace you can ever think of, ranging from the mum and dad flower shop to the big mining companies, so everywhere in between. So we're going to find other places, potentially environments where it might not be appropriate to use them. So we'll just include them into the policy as we find those.
One of those might be early childhood settings.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Andrew, your thoughts?
Oh,
on
it's
that?
the same.
Yeah.
We say to someone, it's our intention to activate these cameras at our meeting today or our inspection today. And they usually say, yeah, whatever, or sure, no problems, we have no objection. I'm not aware of any time, I'm looking to my colleagues, that when
You've been asked to turn it off.
Turn it off, no,
Yeah.
no.
That's good. A very short question here. Does the court ever throw out evidence from body-worn cameras? Have you used evidence in court?
I don't think we have that I can think of. I talked about that case where the evidence didn't make it to court. I think that's a whole separate story, but I'm not aware of them throwing out. It's pretty robust. Yeah.
Glenn?
We're probably too early in the piece
Yeah.
to get a brief up to court yet, but the legal eagles in the world have assured us that there shouldn't be any issues with that. Again, so long as we've exercised our powers in line with our legislation, we've made the necessary announcements that, and this is all captured on the footage, the relevant announcements that we're using a device, you will be recorded. So you get that almost consent at that time. We've been assured there won't be any issues in that regard.
Thank you.
I think police have led the way from that
Yeah.
perspective, thankfully. So on the assumption you've got all of that
Yeah.
in place, they use it all the time.
Yeah.
Just going back to reasons you might not, or times and places you might not use a camera, one participant has asked if there are any cultural nuances you need to be mindful of. They haven't specifically mentioned, First Nations people, but it springs to mind. Are there any, can you see that occurring? Have you talked about it?
Yes, definitely. We've got a section in our policy that deals with vulnerabilities within various cohorts across different demographics. So again, we've got those listed and we're absolutely mindful of those considerations. So again, that forms part of the training when rolling out the policy and the usage of the cameras as to you need to be mindful of those sensitivities. So we don't go in gun-ho saying, I don't care what you've got to say, we're wearing them, we're recording. We expect some dialogue to occur to flesh out some of those sensitivities and those potential vulnerabilities as well with various people.
Yeah, look, I came from a meeting just before coming here where staff had used body-worn cameras, and on reflection, it probably wasn't the best thing given the setting. So we're going to open our policy up and have another look at that. It's not a reflection on the staff. They were doing what the policy says. Okay, but I think given the setting, it's probably not ideal. So we need to give that a little bit more thought. So I agree. There are definitely circumstances where it's suboptimal.
That might be a good segue into, both of you have mentioned policy reviews and updates, and particularly Glenn, you've already been through 4 or 5. Would you be able to expand on, just very briefly, the types of things that you've reflected on and edited? Go first, Glenn.
Some I don't know the detail, I'll be honest, Kerry, but I just know I've signed it 5 times. So some of the things are exactly what we've just probably covered off on some of the nuances that you find where you might have to just change so that staff don't feel obliged to do something when they've got that discretion. So we might have taken things out that may have read to be more mandatory, which are now a little bit more discretionary. We've I think changed the when to activate them. I think at the start it was, when you enter the workplace. We've just brought that forward a little bit, so you can get prepared and then go into the dialogue as soon as you enter the workplace. Just things that have helped smooth, I suppose, the process from an operational point of view. There's other elements that we've probably also reviewed from some of the footage around how it might present. So if you're standing in front of the sun, for example, things like that need to just be reviewed. So references to where you position yourself to get the best coverage, because of course you're not seeing what you're capturing at the time. So little things like that.
Thank you, that's helpful. Andrew?
Yeah, same. Originally it was investigators only. We've broadened that to all authorised officers.
Right.
And how does that work and when should they use it? So the policy just keeps sort of being amended to cope with that. And we should be up to number 5 or 6, not too far down the track. So, but some of the things Glenn's done are not in our policy, so I'll be keen to read
Compare
that.
and contrast.
Yes, yeah.
So picking up on a point you made earlier around staff, we have got a question from the audience around whether you've had any reports of burnout or stress or general, I suppose, negative feedback around their use from your workforce.
Not from my perspective. Indeed, they asked, I was on a site the other day and the staff said, would you like to wear one as well, Andrew? Which I thought was good. They were very comfortable and said, look, we're intending to wear them. We'll take one for you if you'd like us to. And I said, look, I don't see the need. I think 2 cameras is sufficient to gather the information we need. The other 3 is probably starting to look a bit over the top. But I say that because I think, as I said, it shows their level of comfort and acceptance. So, yeah, there's no pushback that I'm aware of.
Glenn?
I think that consultation piece up front is really important. Engage your workforce early and really understand people's concerns, because early concerns was that, what if I miss something and you review the footage and there's a breach that I've missed? Am I going to get into trouble for that? Yeah, things like that people were concerned about. So once you've fleshed out all those concerns, and we've now created this, like I say, risk-based approach where we've only mandated 3 scenarios, if you like, when they should be worn, and that's based on what our inspectors and investigators want them to be used for. So that's helped enormously. So I can't stress enough, don't just bring it in carte blanche, you're all going to be wearing them from Monday. You need to go through that process to really understand what all the benefits are. And at the end of the day, the benefits of protecting the inspectors and investigators. That's number 1 in my mind. So we've had no pushback since implementation.
Thank you.
That I'm aware of.
Sort of along the same lines, I think, but have any of the regulators had any pushback from unions and other staff representative groups in relation to implementation and use?
I wouldn't say pushback. It's like, how can we get them? how could we utilise those as well? I think that's been more the interest. Because, as you would imagine, union officials, for example, play a really important role in minimising health and safety risks at work sites. So they themselves will be faced with all sorts of disputes. It's almost been a keen interest in how could that be utilised in for other functions in other organisations. We certainly haven't had any pushback.
Just turning perspective, we've got a question from somebody asking about whether you've conducted any research on the benefits of the regulated party seeing themselves on display and how that might modify their behaviour. Have you given any consideration?
No research, no.
Yeah.
I think anecdotally, definitely it has an effect, and psychologically it definitely has an effect, but we don't have any research to support that.
Do you play it back to the regulator?
Oh, no, not normally.
No?
No.
Glenn?
Sorry, is the question around, can you just rephrase that?
It's around whether, it specifically asks whether anyone has conducted research on the benefits of the regulated party seeing themselves on a display, I guess reflecting back on their behaviour during the use of the camera. And then I was interested in whether they ever saw it anyway. Yeah.
Look, we did do that through the trial period, so people got, I mean, if you've captured evidence, you can always, the person that's captured it has got access to the system to review how they've interacted with the business anyway. So that's all recorded as well, how many times they access that piece of evidence. So they can see themselves. There's no restriction there. But during the trial, that we created a bit of fun around that. Take a look at how you did this or how you didn't do that or whatever. So that was done openly, and people do probably pick up on a particular way in which they interact. So it's potentially got the benefit of heightening, standards as well in some regard. And I won't say which industry, but the use of language, and I'll say swearing. Some industries are sort of a little bit more attuned to using profanities, and our inspectors may have been sort of immersed in that a little bit. So they might be thinking around, how they might be speaking to various people.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think you might have covered this, but I'll just double check. Are there licence requirements needed for the individual person or camera? I got the sense you were saying camera earlier, but I'll just get you to confirm.
The camera and the software.
Yeah. So it doesn't need to be every person who might use it. Yeah.
The software platform needs a licence per user.
Right.
And the cameras are obviously individual. So the cameras aren't associated with a person as such. We've got a pool of 30, for example. You just take whichever one you want. But to be able to access the software platform, you need a licence per user. So we've got, I think, over 100 users of the platform. So we need 100 licenses for that. But like say, just 30 cameras.
Thank you. Laura, while I check my questions, is there anything you wanted to ask? You were mentioning earlier that you've got lots of questions for Glenn. Is there anything that hasn't been answered yet for you?
No, I'm certainly keen on the evidentiary part of it, particularly if it's potentially going to replace notebooks for an investigator.
It's a future dream of mine.
I can certainly see that because, even notebooks themselves are sort of starting to date and people wanting to use iPads and, how do you show that that's a proper point in time? The other question I had was, so when you interview someone, they generally get a copy of that interview, but from a body-worn camera perspective, you could potentially having a conversation, possibly an interview-like discussion. They don't get a copy of the footage, do they?
No. But they could.
They could, yeah.
Yeah, it's all part of the discovery.
Yeah, particularly given, as you said, I think you get them transcribed as well, which is quite interesting. Okay. Yeah, there's a whole new kind of evidence. There's the lawyer part going. There's a whole new evidence range here that there could be some real opportunities as a regulator, but obviously lots of pitfalls as well.
So we've moved from a statement model to an affidavit model of late, which is statements as a narrative, which somebody's put into like an investigator's asked a few questions, put it into a narrative format, said, "Are you happy with this?" They'll sign it. We've moved to the affidavit model, which is admissible as it is. Yeah. So we see how the use of technologies like this can lean into the affidavit style, and it, like I say, it can transcribe it automatically. So there is that functionality. And there's also some add-ons to this whole platform. Again, we're not here to sell this product, but there's lots of add-ons as well. So there's an interview capability. So we've got another piece of machinery that we can undertake video, audio records of interview. And again, it goes up to that same cloud. So there's all these add-ons that, again, start to strengthen your digital evidence gathering capability. And it does away with, I remember getting digital evidence, take a photograph. This is after the film, the 35mm roll film. You take a picture on a digital camera, you'd come back to the office, you'd take your stick out, you'd put it into your laptop, you'd burn it to a drive, you'd copy that document onto a disk, you'd take the disk out, you'd write on the disk, a reference, you'd put the disk in an evidence bag, you'd write on the evidence bag, seal it up.
Chain of custody there.
Get somebody to witness you, put it into the evidence room, record it in a register log in the evidence room, and that's where it would sit until you next needed it. And I won't go through the process of retrieving some information. So you can imagine the administrative burden that these sorts of processes reduce massively, because it's all gone to a cloud, very secure place, and then you just go in and label things up as and when you need to, and they're there untouched. So the chain of evidence is very solid and strong. Yeah.
All right, well, I think we might have time for one more question. I do have a few questions around the Surveillance Devices Act, and it would be great if you could each wrap up by just reiterating for us again what you needed to introduce or change to comply with that Act.
No change for us.
That's right, that was an easy one for you.
Yeah. So we just need to frame our policy around the requirements of the Surveillance Devices Act. What we're also looking to do is amend the regulations here in South Australia to enable our agency to be recognised as an authorised body. That's just to strengthen up an element of our ability to use surveillance devices.
So it's not a necessary...
It's not. Yeah. No, we can still use them without that, as long as we follow the requirements of the Act, which our policy has been aligned to.
Laura, anything new from your perspective? Was that a learning for you today around this?
We would definitely need legislative amendments. Right. I would say, because our powers under the Mining Act are substantially less than the EPA and what SafeWork have, so I think we would have to, and remembering what's in the Surveillance Devices Act, I think, because you need a clear sort of regulatory remit in your legislation or compulsory power or whatever, and we don't have any of that. So we would definitely need some amendments.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I just want to thank the panel for giving us such practical insights into the implementation and use of them, and the thinking for a new direction for one of our regulators today. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. So thank you for the online participation. We got some great questions from you today. For those of you that are regular participants, you'll know that you'll shortly receive an evaluation survey in your inbox. Please take the time to fill it out. It really helps NRCoP, and they appreciate your feedback. So new year and new goals. We're keen to hear more. If you are keen to hear more about the Professional Regulator Professional Development Programme built by members of the NRCoP in collaboration with Regnet NAU, please join us at an upcoming online information session on Thursday the 7th of December to hear more from Professor Kate Henn from Regnet and Dr. Lorraine Cherney from NRCoP and ANZSOG. Please check out the ANZSOG website for further details. Our next online event will be in February. It's about what does it mean to be a regulator in local government. So please stay tuned for more information on that. Please keep an eye on our socials, LinkedIn and Twitter, and they'll keep you up to date on all future events. Thank you for joining us today.